Hi, this is Richard Lummis with Tom Fox, and we're continuing our presidential series with Herbert Hoover, a generally underrated guy, I think. He had an absolutely fascinating career. One of the reviews of a biography I saw said he flourished at everything he tried except being president. So he started with very humble beginnings. He was the first president born west of the Mississippi. And of course, ended up president. And then he had the longest retirement until Jimmy Carter broke the record some years ago. Tom, why don't you tell us a bit about his early life and education?
And before we do that, I want to pose two questions to both you and our listenership over the Herbert Hoover series. Number one, we have already had with Robert Taft a very long discussion about resume and all of the things you can do pre-president to perhaps indicate you're prepared to be president. And I think we'll have that same discussion around George Bush the first. So this is perhaps, well, certainly one of the most impressive pre-presidential resumes in the history of the U.S. presidency. So what does resume mean, comma, if anything? And the second is a question I heard Bass Wallace ask Jim Baker at an event in Houston. And it was leading up to the first Obama run. And Bass Wallace asked Jim Baker, "You think Obama's qualified to be president?" And Jim Baker's answer was, "Here's how you determine if someone's qualified to be president. You elect him president and see if they can do the job." And not simply because I knew the participants of that query, do I remember it so well, but it was so brilliant. And it seems to me to be, if not a theme of this presidential leadership series, but certainly a question that you could ask of a US president, of a corporate CEO, of, the head of your hunting club, whatever it is. How do you determine if someone's ready if they've never done it? And if they're being elected for their first term as president, we can guarantee they've never done it. And so that's just a question I've wanted to pose throughout this series. And this seemed to me to be as good a one as any. So I'm going to ask our listeners and you to maybe think about both of those and explore if they're valid questions, how we should think about them, or maybe just consider those as we go through this, because this truly, I thought I knew who Herbert Hoover was. And as with almost all of the presidents we have studied in this series, I was sadly not mistaken, but did not have the full picture. This man had one of the most impressive business backgrounds, but as an un, as an untraditional business background as you could have in the 19th and early 20th century, or I guess maybe even just the 20th century, because it was international. And of all of the great Americans we have studied in both 12 O'Clock High, Presidential Leadership, and other series together, I'm not sure we have studied a U.S. business person who rose to prominence on the international scene. So that to me just jumped out. But overcoming the poverty of his early upbringing and even tragedy, because he was born into a devout Quaker family, yet was orphaned at age 9. And once again, through hook, nook, crook, hard work, or whatever it was, made himself into just a great business person, a great humanitarian. He was in the first class at Leland J. Stanford Jr. University, then college. Most people don't forget that's the full name of Stanford, because Leland J. Stanford named it in honor of his son who predeceased him. So he's the first graduating class of Stanford studying geology. He had an incredible work ethic. He had incredible resilience, and he had incredible pragmatism, all shaped by his early struggles, frankly, of losing his parents, being sent to live with a distant relative, of moving from Iowa devout Quaker community to California to literally being in the first class at Stanford. So in the first 20 plus years of his life, he lived a lifetime that many of us might even envy today. And it set him up for a business career that I know you're going to take a little bit of time going into. But I really hope our listeners will focus on the business part of what Hoover did and how it would have seemed to have given him a perspective that would have been literally light years past any American at the time in question, or even moving into his presidential years of both the geology aspect that I know you'll talk about, but also the economic aspect, but how he was mired in an economic way of thinking um, that was so laissez-faire that it was really overwhelmed during his presidency. So I'm not sure I've set it up even fairly enough for that because this was just a stunning business career.
Well, it really was. I mean, as you pointed out, he graduated from Stanford with a degree in geology, but following graduation, the only job he could find was working 70 hours a week pushing ore carts at a gold mine. So he did that for a while.
Much like your career, starting out at the bottom.
Then he got in touch with a firm that needed an engineer to evaluate mines for purchase. And so he moved to Australia in 1897 and worked there for a couple of years. And he was in China from 1899 to 1902. And then he was all over the world. Of course, China at that time was mired in the Boxer Rebellion. And another interesting facet that blends his business and personal lives is that his wife traveled with him. She had been the only female geology major at Stanford and was in China with him during the Boxer Rebellion. She ended up speaking, I think, 8 languages. Just as an aside, he certainly was not the only smart person in the household. But they moved back to America, and he opened a mining consultancy in 1908, and by 1914, he was financially secure with several high-salaried board positions, owning some silver mines in what was then Burma, and he had a nice income and royalties from writing the leading textbook on mining engineering. I think, but he's generally classified as a very shy, sensitive, introverted man, and I think his success certainly influenced his opinion on the relative importance of individual effort versus government help. But you could still see some of the tensions that bedeviled his presidency and in his business career. For instance, in Australia, he imported Italian immigrants in order to cut costs by undercutting the local labor and to counter the local union movement. He opposed minimum wages and workers' comp. And then in China, he definitely had a racist attitude toward the workers, regarding them as inefficient and racially inferior. But at the same time, he ended the long-term servitude contracts that had been customary, and he instituted merit-based promotion. His specialty was rejuvenating troubled mines, troubles, whether in geologic terms, but often in labor terms. But he did introduce innovative processes for handling ore, and eventually came around to endorse the 8-hour workday and organized labor. So you can already see some tension there between his generally progressive management style and his generally extremely conservative political style. Anyway, prior to World War One, or the U.S. entry into World War One, he was independently wealthy and very highly regarded. And I think that's why he was tapped for some of the positions he was during World War One by Wilson, which I think you're going to tell us a bit about.
Yeah, and really, this is where either my confusion or I misunderstood something here, Richard, and perhaps we can talk through this. And that's not even the right term. The humanitarian leadership he showed, I thought, gave him a broader context for what government intervention could do when the time was dire or the time was needed or even the time was right for government intervention. And the first sort of series of government interventions he was involved in were those times, and that was during and after World War One. And he worked as a leader in the Commission for Relief in Belgium, saving millions from starvation by literally putting production lines and supply chains together to get food to Belgium. But he also served in the Wilson administration as the head of the U.S. Food Administration, rationing, helping the U.S. to ration things like meat through a Meatless Monday and other strategies which helped the U.S. war effort. But it was his I knew of his work as a great humanitarian outside the United States, and I guess I had thought that would have given him a broader perspective than some of the economic laissez-faire that we saw, or perhaps the problems he faced during his presidency were of such an order of magnitude beyond what we had seen ever, that he did move away from laissez-faire economic principles, but it wasn't enough, and then he got blamed for everything. And I've sort of thought about it in the terms of the little relief that the English tried to give during the Irish potato famine. There were some efforts, but it was sorely not enough. But then after the war, he also organized, broadened out his humanitarian efforts, and not simply a relief for Belgium, but relief for the entire European continent. So he had this reputation as a great humanitarian. And once again, when we take the business heart of his career and now put it with the humanitarian part, and I know you're going to talk about his political career, we're moving towards one of the true great resumes of a world citizen in the early part of the 20th century. And I opened our pod with those two questions. And what does resume mean? Does it mean you have the top businessman or one of the top businessmen? Does it mean you have a top businessman plus a top humanitarian who has answered the call in the direst of emergencies, which was the Great War, now what we call World War One? And so I saw his humanitarian effort. I guess incorrectly saw, perhaps is the best phrase I can think of, that it would have given him a broader view. And I don't want to criticize too much because in many ways I think he made steps during his presidency that were, I don't even want to say baby steps, but there were steps that were taken and they were simply not enough for the situation at the time. I don't know if I've made even a question in all of that for you to consider. Pose back to you, but do you see sort of any of those things here, or are they so separate and distinct that you really don't see that they build on each other, or at least leading to a different worldview?
Well, I think the part of it, of course, is that the relief aids were largely individual charities rather than government funded. So you may not have seen that as the proper role of government. And I'm still a little torn about his pacifism going up into World War II. And yeah, I think it's possible, I don't know for sure, that he regarded World War One as government action, and that the need for relief was actually prompted by government action rather than individuals. So I think his life was, you see a lot of the tension of these things. And of course, the times were very interesting with the rise of anarchism and socialism and then eventually communism, all of which he felt very strongly against. But he did come out of the experience of organizing relief as a very attractive political candidate. Prior to that, he showed no real appetite for politics. But progressive of both parties really wanted him to join them because he had at that time had adopted some much more progressive stances than you'd seen earlier in his career. He was pro civil rights during the Red Scare. And of course, the civil rights there is not racial, but really a matter of free speech. He supported a 48-hour work week, the minimum wage, and the elimination of child labor. all of which probably evinced a real evolution in his views from earlier in his career. In 1920, he declared himself a Republican and sort of sought the nomination for president. But when it became obvious he wasn't going to win, he backed Harding as a reward for which he became Secretary of Commerce from 1921 to 1928. And there, his policies were seeking a sort of third way between capitalism and socialism. But he never really could bring himself to support straightforward government intervention. He felt the role of government was to help eliminate waste and increase production. It should encourage good business practices like the adoption of data-based policies. Government could invest in infrastructure, and part of this job was the conservation of natural resources. And he really tried very hard to balance the interests of labor, capital, and government in order to achieve an optimum outcome. And I think this is something that we see over and over again, too, is where an extremely bright person has all these wonderful ideas, but has no real way to put them into practice. And I think maybe he was already becoming sort of overwhelmed is too strong, but I mean, he's trying to do too much for one man, and he wasn't all that great at delegating.
Oh, much like Jared Kushner in the first Trump administration.
But as Secretary of Commerce, he did play a key role in the regulation of radio, and he boosted air travel. He promoted traffic standardization across the country, which greatly helped the adoption of the automobile. He promoted the then radically new long-term home mortgage, which stimulated home construction. He helped negotiate the Colorado River Compact, dividing up water among the western states. He oversaw the federal response to the 1927 Mississippi flood, an event that is now sort of forgotten, but caused massive changes in America. The federal response was, I guess, limited. And the local response tended to be to use physical coercion to force blacks to do unpaid labor, leading many of them to move north. And it was one of the first impetuses for the great migration northward of blacks. Coolidge's decision not to run in 1928 surprised him, and I think Coolidge was at best lukewarm about him. The Mellon and Charles Evan Hughes both declined to run, and other contenders kind of fizzled out. So he won the nomination on the first ballot in 1928 to become president. So
I'd like to pick up on a couple of the points you raised, Richard. The first was around on the Red Scare, the Palmer raids, and those issues around the paranoia around communism in the United States at the end of and immediately after World War I, and Hoover seeing the issue as a free speech issue. And that seemed to me to almost tie into what I saw from his business career as a laissez-faire businessman, that the government didn't have any business telling people what they couldn't say. Now, that's obviously based on the constitutional right under the First Amendment, but it was a little more, I saw it as really laissez-faire as opposed to some radical free speech belief. And not that that confused progressives, but maybe they saw Hoover a little bit more in their camp than he really was on that. And then that same sort of analysis around his views in the 20s on the role of government and labor unions. And I know under FDR, we'll get into a section on the FDR's relationship with unions, growth of unions under FDR, and the National or Labor Relations Act, or what was then called the Wagner Act. But Hoover held the view, and I think you correctly articulated it, that government was not there to really advocate one way or the other for labor or management. It was there to be a neutral. And I thought he advocated that position, which was intellectually supported in the 20s, certainly even by progressives. And I'm not sure if I know there was certainly a very vibrant labor movement in the 20s, but I'm not sure even Samuel Gompers from the AFL really pushed for government intervention on behalf of labor unions in the 20s to the extent it was done by FDR. So what I can't tell is, did Hoover have a intellectually conservative position that turned out not to be what was needed at the time, or did events overtake his position and those who had a similar vein of thinking as he did by FDR, by the needs to support labor unions in the 30s, that became so much a part of the discussion, particularly in terms of strikes and other labor actions that are now relatively famous, at least in labor history. So, any real thoughts on those, or once again, am I just off base?
I think you're generally right. He viewed government more as a facilitator, I guess, than an independent actor in these things. And I think in general with the Great Depression, he was simply overwhelmed by events. I think you know, without getting into the argument over FDR's lengthening or shortening the Great Depression through his actions, I think Hoover was intellectually incapable of adopting such radical government interventions simply because it wasn't part of his moral philosophy, really. And I think he did regard a lot of these things in moral terms, as strange as that sounds to the contemporary.
Well, and there's two other areas I'd like to explore because I still find them not only relevant, but things that we literally talk about to this day. The first was the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. And that was, by all accounts, one of the most devastating floods of the Mississippi River, uh, all the way through Mississippi, Tennessee, down to the coast, down to New Orleans. The levee system around New Orleans and indeed up the Mississippi was constructed as a result of that flood. And it was one of the great early government interventions for environmental reasons that we had seen. And up until that time, we really had never seen the federal government at any level get involved. And here, not only were they involved somewhat with the immediate fight to save what land they could, but it led to a much more comprehensive look and water conservation system up and down the Mississippi. And then we still have that today. It's largely what was constructed after that flood. But the other one was what we now call Hoover Dam. And that water system through the Western territories, now Western states, we literally live by that in 2025. And so whether you agree or disagree on the series of dams that were built and land that was lost, but water conservation gains that were made, it is still something in use today. And, we've talked about in this podcast, going back to Teddy Roosevelt and his creation of the national park system and an environmental movement. I really see almost the treaty that Hoover helped shepherd through with the Western states on the water distribution rights as one of the kind of founding documents of the American environmental movement. And literally in 2025, we're still living with that and from that today.
Well, yeah. The other thing that struck me about that was the extraordinary pettiness that infected politics at the time, which I thought wasn't the case. The Harold Ickes, FDR's Secretary of the Interior, changed the name of the dam prior to its dedication from Hoover Dam to Boulder Dam. And Hoover wasn't even invited to attend the dedication. He wasn't even mentioned in FDR's speech at the dedication. And it wasn't until 1947 that the name was restored to Hoover Dam. But
I mean, this in American politics, that's new. Part of the Gulf of America.
Yeah, the sector. I was hearing about that today.
And I always thought it was the Gulf of Texas.
So there we go.
So, Richard, I just want to end maybe just by asking our listeners to think about the questions that we started with. This is just as fabulous a career up until this point as I think you could have in America. And once again, let me emphasize the international scope of this. Not too many businessmen at this point in America have risen to this level with such an international scope, both on the private business side and then later moving to government or humanitarian service on the humanitarian side. So I don't, I, I I guess I don't have to give a spoiler alert. Everyone knows where this goes, but it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out in part two. So I hope our listeners will listen to Presidency of Herbert Hoover Part 2.